The arrival Marcus Rivera had precisely 3 minutes to find his seat before the Treaty of Seven Worlds ceremony began, and he was fairly certain those 3 minutes would determine whether his diplomatic career ended in quiet resignation or spectacular public failure. The transport pod had malfunctioned halfway to the Crystal Spire Palace, leaving him stranded in a maintenance corridor while automated systems rerouted power and his anxiety levels climbed steadily toward panic. By the time he'd finally reached the ceremonial hall, the preliminary briefing had concluded, the other Earth delegates had been seated, and Marcus was left standing at the entrance to a space so vast and alien it made his brain hurt. The hall stretched before him like a cathedral designed by beings who understood geometry in ways humans didn't. The ceiling curved upward in impossible arcs, crystalline structures refracting light into patterns that seemed to shift and pulse with meaning. Columns rose from the polished floor, their surfaces etched with symbols that probably told the entire history of Viridian civilization. Marcus had read exactly 4 pages of the cultural briefing document before his data tablet had corrupted during the transport malfunction, leaving him with fragments of information about proper greeting gestures and absolutely nothing about seating protocols. 500 seats filled the hall, arranged in sections that followed some logic Marcus couldn't decipher. He could see delegates from the Krillian Consortium in their environmental suits, their insectoid forms perfectly still in the eastern quadrant. The Morphean representatives occupied a raised platform to the south, their shape-shifting bodies adopting forms that suggested respect and attention. And everywhere, scattered throughout the space in numbers that dominated the assembly, were the Viridians themselves. The Viridian presence. The Viridians were humanoid in the way that made cross-species diplomacy possible, but different enough that Marcus had spent his first week on their homeworld struggling not to stare. They stood taller than most humans, with elongated limbs that moved with liquid grace. Their skin held an iridescent quality, shifting through subtle color variations that Marcus had learned indicated emotional states he couldn't reliably interpret. But it was their faces that captured attention, elegant features with large eyes that held colors human genetics had never produced, and the distinctive cranial crests that rose from their foreheads, unique to each individual like fingerprints. The Viridians in the hall wore formal robes that identified house affiliations through patterns Marcus couldn't read. Deep blues and silvers seemed prominent near the front sections, while crimson and gold dominated the western areas. He spotted what appeared to be military officials in structured garments that incorporated metallic elements, and scholars in flowing robes decorated with symbols that probably indicated their fields of expertise. Marcus stood frozen at the entrance, his formal diplomatic attire suddenly feeling inadequate despite the hours he'd spent ensuring every detail met protocol standards. He was supposed to be seated with the Earth delegation, somewhere in the diplomatic quarter that had been assigned to humanity's representatives. The problem was that he had no idea where that section was located, and asking anyone at this point seemed likely to cause the exact kind of disruption he was desperately trying to avoid. The search begins. He moved forward because standing still drew more attention than purposeful movement, even if that purpose was entirely fictional. Marcus walked along the outer edge of the seating arrangements, his eyes scanning desperately for any familiar faces. Ambassador Chin should be somewhere near the front, her position as Earth's primary representative guaranteeing her a prominent location. If he could spot her, he could navigate toward the human section and slide into whatever seat remained available. The seats around him held Viridian nobles whose cranial crests bore jeweled decorations that suggested high rank. They watched him pass with expressions he couldn't interpret, their eyes tracking his movement with predatory precision. Marcus felt sweat forming along his spine despite the carefully controlled temperature of the hall. The Viridians preferred their environments slightly cooler than human comfort standards, but his anxiety was generating enough heat to compensate that he passed a section marked with flowing script in the Viridian language, symbols his translator implant struggled to process quickly enough to be useful. The seats held officials in deep purple robes, their postures perfect, their attention now divided between whatever they'd been discussing and the confused human wandering past their area. Marcus nodded politely, a gesture that might mean absolutely nothing in Viridian culture or might constitute a grave insult. His incomplete briefing hadn't covered nodding protocols. Another section displayed banners in crimson and silver, the seats occupied by Viridians whose bearing suggested military background. They sat with the rigid discipline of warriors trained to maintain composure in any circumstance, and Marcus felt their collective gaze assess him as he walked by. Threat evaluation or simple curiosity, he couldn't tell. His ability to read Viridian body language was approximately as developed as his understanding of their seating arrangements, which was to say essentially non-existent. The empty seats. Marcus spotted empty seats scattered throughout the hall, but each option appeared wrong for reasons he could sense but not articulate. Several seats near the front seemed too prominent for someone of his junior rank. The Earth delegation surely wouldn't be positioned that close to the royal platform where the Viridian Emperor and Empress would preside. Other empty seats clustered in sections where everyone wore house colors he didn't recognize, and inserting himself among unknown political groupings seemed like an excellent way to create an international incident through sheer ignorance. Near the back, he noticed vacant seats in what appeared to be the military quarter, but the warriors occupying that section looked like they'd been attending formal ceremonies since before Marcus was born. Their formal armor incorporated ceremonial elements that probably signified achievements and honors he couldn't identify. Sitting among them uninvited might constitute disrespect to military traditions he knew nothing about. His translator implant fed him fragments of conversation from nearby Viridians, automated systems converting their musical language into phrases he could understand. Discussions about weather patterns, trade negotiations, and philosophical observations about the nature of interspecies cooperation. Nothing helpful regarding where lost human diplomats should position themselves during treaty ceremonies. Marcus checked his wrist device, hoping for a message from Ambassador Chin or any of the other Earth delegates. The screen remained empty except for a notification that the ceremony would begin in approximately 90 seconds. His heart rate accelerated and he forced himself to breathe slowly, a technique from the stress management training that now seemed laughably inadequate for the current situation. The shift in atmosphere, the ambient noise in the hall changed, conversations quieting as attention shifted toward the eastern entrance. Marcus followed the collective gaze and felt his already elevated anxiety spike into something approaching terror. The crowd was reacting to an arrival, someone important enough that 500 delegates from 7 different worlds simultaneously adjusted their focus. Princess Liara Starwind of the Viridian Royal House entered the ceremonial hall with the kind of presence that required no announcement. She moved with perfect fluid grace, her formal robes a deep midnight blue that seemed to absorb light and reflect it in subtle patterns. The fabric incorporated threads of silver that caught the crystalline lighting, creating an effect that was simultaneously beautiful and slightly hypnotic. Her cranial crest rose elegantly from her forehead, decorated with platinum chains set with stones that probably cost more than Marcus's entire education. Marcus had seen images of Princess Liara during his preparation for this assignment. Official portraits that conveyed her position as third in succession to the Viridian throne, formal recordings of diplomatic functions where she represented her family with perfect protocol and icy composure. What the images hadn't captured was the intensity of her physical presence, the way she seemed to command the space around her through sheer force of controlled authority. Her face was composed in an expression of serene dignity, features that suggested generations of selective breeding for leadership qualities. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, eyes that held a violet color rare even among Viridians. She was beautiful in the way that classical architecture was beautiful, perfectly proportioned and slightly intimidating. Her gaze swept the hall with mechanical precision, cataloging attendees with practiced efficiency. The unexpected approach Marcus instinctively moved aside, clearing the path between Princess Liara and the royal section where she would obviously be seated. He pressed himself against a nearby column, trying to become invisible while she passed. Junior technical analysts did not attract the attention of alien royalty, especially not when they were lost and confused and approximately 60 seconds away from the ceremony, starting with them still standing awkwardly in the wrong section. But Princess Liara didn't walk past him. Her trajectory shifted with subtle precision, her stride maintaining its measured pace while her direction changed. She was walking directly toward him, and Marcus's brain struggled through rapidly escalating confusion toward something approaching alarm. Protocol dictated he should probably bow, except he'd never practiced bowing to Viridian royalty and had no idea what the appropriate depth or duration might be. Standing still seemed safer than attempting a gesture that might accidentally convey disrespect or inappropriate familiarity. He stood frozen as she approached, aware that every eye in the hall was now tracking this unexpected deviation from expected behavior. Princess Liara reached him and stopped, close enough that Marcus could see the subtle color shifts in her iridescent skin, patterns that moved across her features like emotions made visible. Her eyes met his with startling directness, and for a moment Marcus forgot to breathe entirely. Then her hand moved with decisive speed, fingers closing around his wrist with surprising strength. Her skin was cooler than human standard, her grip firm and absolutely certain. The touch sent a shock of awareness through Marcus's entire nervous system, and he was distantly aware that this probably constituted some kind of significant gesture in Viridian culture, except he had no idea what it meant. "Sit beside me," Princess Liara said in perfect Earth standard, her voice carrying absolute authority and musical accent that marked her as Viridian nobility. There was no question in her tone, no suggestion that Marcus had any choice in the matter. She was issuing a command with the complete expectation of immediate obedience, the royal section. Then she pulled, not roughly but with clear intent, guiding Marcus away from his frozen position near the column toward a section of seating that he now recognized with dawning horror as the royal area. Positions reserved for the imperial family and their specifically chosen companions, located on a raised platform that provided clear sight lines to every delegate in the hall while simultaneously marking its occupants as separate from and above the General Assembly. Marcus's feet moved automatically, following her lead because his brain had completely abandoned rational thought in favor of screaming panic. He was vaguely aware of the stunned silence that had fallen over the hall, of hundreds of Viridian cranial crests going rigid with shock, of whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd like a physical wave. His translator implant caught fragments of exclamations in multiple languages, expressions of disbelief and speculation that his overwhelmed mind couldn't fully process. Princess Liara led him to a cushioned bench position directly beside her own elevated seat, a location that placed him prominently in the royal section with perfect visibility to everyone assembled. She released his wrist and gestured imperiously at the space with a hand movement that conveyed unmistakable command. "Sit," she said simply. Marcus sat. He sat because standing seemed worse, because running would definitely create an even larger diplomatic incident, and because some small part of his brain that still functioned suggested that when alien royalty tells you to sit in front of 500 witnesses, you sit and worry about the implications later. Princess Liara settled beside him with the same perfect composure she'd entered with, arranging her robes with practiced precision. Her hands folded in her lap, her posture immaculate, her expression serene. She appeared utterly unbothered by the reaction her actions had caused, as if publicly selecting a foreign diplomat to sit in the royal section was completely normal behavior that required no explanation. The aftermath. Marcus sat rigidly beside her, hyper-aware that he was now the center of attention for an entire hall full of alien nobility and had absolutely no idea what cultural protocol he'd just participated in or violated. His mind raced through the fragments of his incomplete briefing, desperately searching for any reference to seating customs, royal prerogatives, or what it meant when a princess physically grabbed your wrist in front of her entire court. He came up empty on all counts. The silence in the grand hall lasted approximately 5 more seconds before erupting into barely controlled chaos. Whispered conversations conducted in urgent tones, delegates leaning toward each other with animated gestures, cranial crests tilting and shifting in patterns that Marcus suspected communicated entire volumes of shock and speculation without requiring words. His translator implant struggled to process the multiple simultaneous conversations, feeding him disconnected phrases about tradition and protocol and unprecedented actions. Princess Liara sat beside him throughout the commotion, her expression unchanged, her posture perfect. If she noticed or cared about the disruption she'd caused, she gave no indication. Her eyes remained fixed forward, watching the empty royal platform where her parents would soon appear. But there was something in the set of her shoulders, a subtle tension that suggested she was very aware of everything happening around them. Marcus's wrist device vibrated with an incoming message. He glanced down to see Ambassador Chen's name and a preview of her text that simply read, "Marcus, where are you? I can't locate you in our section." Marcus looked at the princess sitting calmly beside him, at the nobles staring with expressions ranging from shock to outrage, at the royal section where he was now prominently displayed like some kind of diplomatic curiosity. He had no idea how to explain his current position in a way that wouldn't immediately end his career or possibly create an interstellar incident. The gesture. Princess Liara chose that moment to do something that made the whispers intensify into an audible roar throughout the hall. She reached over with calm deliberation and took Marcus's hand in hers, a gesture so deliberate and public that it couldn't possibly be misinterpreted as accidental. Not a brief touch, not a formal gesture required by protocol, but a clear grasping of his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, her grip firm and obviously intentional to everyone watching. Her hand was cool against his, her fingers longer and more elegant than human standard, and she showed absolutely no indication of planning to release him anytime soon. The touch felt intimate in a way that transcended species differences, and Marcus's brain finally provided some useful context through his panic that if Viridians had customs even remotely similar to humans regarding physical contact and personal space, he was currently sitting in the royal section holding hands with a princess known throughout the empire for her cold formality and rigid adherence to protocol. in front of her entire court and representatives from 6 other alien civilizations. The political implications were probably catastrophic in ways his limited diplomatic training couldn't even begin to calculate. A Viridian official approached the royal section, an elderly woman whose cranial crest bore decorations suggesting high rank and long service. Her robes incorporated house colors Marcus couldn't identify, and her face held an expression of barely controlled fury mixed with something that might have been fear. She stopped at the base of the platform, her posture formally correct even as her color shifts indicated intense emotional response. "Your Highness," the official began, her Earth standard flawless despite the musical accent. "The ceremony cannot begin with the seating arrangements in such disorder. Perhaps the human delegate would be more comfortable in his assigned section with his people." Princess Liara didn't release Marcus's hand. She turned her head slowly toward the official, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried throughout the hall with perfect clarity. "Marcus Rivera sits where I have placed him, by my choice and my right as Princess of the Royal House. The ceremony will begin when my parents arrive as scheduled. The seating arrangements are exactly as they should be." The official's color shifts accelerated, patterns rippling across her skin that Marcus's limited knowledge suggested indicated protest or objection. But she bowed formally and retreated without further argument, because apparently even high-ranking court officials didn't contradict direct statements from members of the imperial family. Marcus sat frozen, the princess's hand still holding his, and wondered what series of decisions in his life had led to this exact moment. He joined the diplomatic corps thinking he'd analyze technical data and file reports about infrastructure compatibility. Instead, he was holding hands with alien royalty while 500 witnesses watched and whispered and probably composed reports that would reach Earth before the ceremony even concluded. The ceremonial drums began their slow rhythm, announcing the imminent arrival of the Emperor and Empress. Throughout the hall, delegates rose to their feet in synchronized response to tradition. Princess Liara stood gracefully, finally releasing Marcus's hand to arrange her robes. Marcus stood as well, his legs uncertain but functional, and tried to remember if he was supposed to bow when the monarchs appeared or if humans followed different protocols. Princess Liara glanced at him, her violet eyes meeting his for just a moment. There was something in her expression that might have been reassurance or possibly amusement at his obvious confusion. She leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping to a level only he could hear. "Trust me," she said simply, "and follow my lead." Then the Emperor and Empress entered the hall, and Marcus's fragmented understanding of the situation was about to become considerably more complicated. The Imperial Presence Emperor Theron Starwind and Empress Myanna entered the ceremonial hall with the kind of presence that made everyone else seem somehow less substantial by comparison. They moved in perfect synchronization, their formal robes incorporating colors that shifted and flowed like liquid light. The Emperor's cranial crest bore a crown of crystallized metal that seemed to grow from his skull rather than rest upon it, while the Empress wore ornaments that caught the hall's lighting and scattered it in patterns too complex to be accidental. Marcus bowed at what he hoped was the appropriate moment and depth, following Princess Liara's movements a half-second behind like a poorly synchronized dancer. Throughout the hall, delegates from 7 worlds paid respect according to their various customs. The Krillians produced harmonious tones from their vocal chambers, the Morphians shifted their forms into shapes that suggested reverence, and the Viridians bowed with their right hands over their hearts in traditional acknowledgement of imperial authority. The Emperor and Empress ascended to their platform, positioning themselves on thrones that appeared to be carved from single pieces of crystal. Their eyes swept the assembly with practiced efficiency, cataloging attendees and no doubt noting anything unusual about the arrangements. When the Emperor's gaze reached the royal section and registered his daughter sitting beside a human diplomat, his expression remained perfectly composed. But his color shifts accelerated just slightly, patterns that Marcus's limited knowledge suggested might indicate surprise or possibly concern. The Empress's reaction was more subtle, just a momentary pause in her movements before she settled into her throne. Her eyes lingered on Marcus for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and he felt that gaze assess him with uncomfortable precision. Whatever she saw apparently didn't require immediate comment, because she turned her attention forward and raised her hand in the traditional gesture that signaled the ceremony should begin. The opening rituals, the Treaty of 7 Worlds was being renewed after 50 cycles of cooperation, trade, and mutual defense. Marcus had read the historical background during his preparation, understanding that this agreement represented decades of negotiation and compromise across species with different biologies, philosophies, and evolutionary histories. The ceremony itself would last several hours, incorporating elements from each civilization's traditions into a blended ritual that honored everyone while fully satisfying no one. A Viridian scholar approached the central platform, her robes decorated with symbols indicating her role as official historian. She began reciting the treaty's origins in the musical Viridian language, each phrase translated simultaneously by everyone's implants into their native tongues. Marcus heard the words in Earth Standard while presumably the Krillians received the same information in their harmonic communication system and the Morphians in whatever form of language they preferred. Throughout the recitation, Marcus sat rigidly beside Princess Liara, aware of hostile stares from various sections of the hall. Several Viridian nobles in the crimson and gold section appeared particularly displeased, their color shifts indicating emotions that Marcus suspected weren't positive. One individual, a male Viridian whose cranial crest bore military decorations, stared at Marcus with an expression that transcended species barriers in its clarity. Whatever Marcus's presence in the royal section meant, that particular noble wanted him to know his position was unacceptable. Princess Liara maintained her serene composure throughout the opening rituals, her attention apparently focused on the ceremony. But twice she glanced at Marcus, brief looks that might have been checking his condition or possibly offering silent reassurance. Her hand rested on the bench between them, close enough that he could feel the slight coolness radiating from her skin. The historian concluded her recitation and retreated, replaced by representatives from each of the 7 worlds who would speak about their civilization's commitments to continued cooperation. The Krillian ambassador produced tones that Marcus's implant translated as poetic descriptions of unity and mutual benefit. The Morphian representative adopted a form that somehow suggested strength and flexibility simultaneously while discussing adaptation and change. The intermission when the Viridian representative completed her portion of the opening ceremonies, the Emperor announced a brief intermission before the treaty signing would begin. Throughout the hall, delegates rose from their seats, many immediately forming small groups for quiet conversations. Marcus saw Ambassador Chen approaching the royal section with several other Earth diplomats, their faces showing carefully controlled expressions that suggested they had many questions about why their junior technical analyst was sitting in the royal section holding hands with alien royalty. Before they could reach the platform, a Viridian court official intercepted them with polite but firm gestures that redirected them toward a different area. The official, a male whose robes incorporated crimson and gold, then turned his attention to the royal section itself. He ascended the platform steps with precise movements, his color shifts indicating barely controlled anger beneath his formal composure. Princess Liara, the official began, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Lord Chancellor Varen requests the honor of speaking with you regarding the seating arrangements for the remainder of the ceremony. Princess Liara regarded the official with cool assessment. Lord Chancellor Varen may request many things. I am currently occupied with my guest and have no time for discussions about seating protocols that have already been established. The official's color shifts accelerated, patterns rippling across his visible skin. Your Highness, the arrangement challenges long-standing agreements between House Starwind and House Crimson. Lord Varen's son was to be seated beside you during this ceremony as part of negotiations negotiations that I did not agree to, Princess Liara interrupted, her voice remaining calm but taking on an edge that suggested immovable certainty. My father may arrange political marriages as he wishes, but I retain the right to choose my ceremonial companions according to traditional law. That right supersedes any agreement the Lord Chancellor believes he has secured. Marcus's brain, which had been struggling with basic comprehension all day, suddenly provided helpful context. Political marriage. The princess was supposed to be seated beside some noble's son as part of arranged marriage negotiations. Instead, she grabbed Marcus and publicly claimed him as her chosen companion, effectively rejecting the arrangement in the most visible way possible. The official opened his mouth to respond, then apparently thought better of whatever he'd been about to say. He bowed stiffly and retreated, his color shifts indicating he would definitely be reporting this conversation to Lord Chancellor Varen, and that report would not be positive. The private revelation. Princess Liara stood gracefully and gestured for Marcus to follow. She led him away from the royal section toward a small alcove partially hidden by crystalline columns. The space offered relative privacy while still maintaining visual connection to the ceremonial hall, a location where conversations could occur without being easily overheard by hundreds of curious delegates. She turned to face him directly, her violet eyes meeting his with uncomfortable intensity. For a long moment she simply studied him, her expression revealing nothing. Then she spoke in a voice carefully modulated to carry only to his ears. You have no idea why I chose you, do you? Marcus shook his head, not trusting his voice to produce anything coherent. His diplomatic training had covered negotiation strategies and cultural sensitivity protocols, but nothing that prepared him for conversations with alien princesses who had just disrupted their own political arrangements on his behalf. 3 months ago, Princess Liara continued, there was a diplomatic incident involving the Krillian trade delegation. You were present, though your role was minor. Do you remember? Marcus's mind raced backward through recent months. 3 months ago, he'd been assisting with technical compatibility assessments for a proposed trade agreement. There had been a reception where something had gone wrong, some kind of accident with the environmental systems that the Krillians required. He'd helped evacuate the affected area and had rendered assistance to a young Viridian who'd been caught in the malfunction. The individual had been sick from environmental contamination, and Marcus had used his emergency medical training to stabilize them until proper medical personnel arrived. The young Viridian you assisted, Princess Liara said, watching his face. That was my brother, Prince Kale. He is fourth in line to the throne and extremely important to our family. The environmental malfunction that day was not an accident but a deliberate attack by political opponents who hoped to create chaos during sensitive negotiations. You saved his life through your quick response and your medical knowledge. Marcus stared at her, pieces of incomplete information suddenly assembling into a picture he hadn't recognized. I didn't know who he was, he said finally. He was just someone who needed help. Exactly, Princess Liara replied, and for the first time her expression softened slightly. You provided assistance without calculating political advantage or seeking recognition. That action created what we call a life debt in Viridian culture. My brother owed you his life, and by extension, my family owed you a debt that could only be acknowledged through specific formal gestures. Sitting beside you in the royal section, Marcus said, understanding beginning to penetrate his confusion. Today's ceremony was the first appropriate occasion to publicly acknowledge the debt according to our traditions, Princess Liara explained. I had to make the gesture during a formal gathering witnessed by multiple civilizations, and I had to do so in a way that clearly demonstrated the debt's importance. Choosing you as my ceremonial companion accomplishes both requirements while also sending very clear messages to my father and his political allies. The political complications. Marcus absorbed this information, his mind processing the implications. Your father arranged for you to sit beside Lord Varen's son. Some kind of political marriage negotiation. An arrangement I never agreed to, Princess Liara confirmed. By Viridian law, I have the right to refuse political marriages until I reach my 30th cycle. I have 4 more cycles remaining, which my father apparently decided to ignore in his eagerness to secure House Crimson's political support. By publicly claiming you as my chosen companion, I have exercised my legal rights while simultaneously honoring my family's life debt. Neither action can be challenged under traditional law. But both actions have made a lot of people very angry, Marcus observed, thinking of Lord Chancellor Varen's official and the hostile stares from the Crimson and Gold section. Yes, Princess Liara agreed simply. House Crimson expected today's ceremony to formalize their political alliance with my family. Instead, they received a very public rejection that cannot be easily explained away. Lord Varen is powerful, connected to multiple military houses, and not accustomed to his plans being disrupted. He will respond, though I cannot predict exactly how. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerating again. So I'm now in the middle of a political conflict between royal houses on an alien planet, and everyone thinks I'm somehow involved in breaking up a political marriage arrangement. Essentially correct, Princess Liara said, and Marcus thought he detected a hint of sympathy in her voice. I apologize for placing you in this position without warning or preparation. But the life debt required public acknowledgement, and using that debt to simultaneously assert my legal independence served multiple purposes. You were, unfortunately, the most efficient solution to several complicated problems. Efficient solution, Marcus repeated. That's one way to describe completely disrupting my diplomatic career and possibly my continued survival on this planet. The request for trust. Princess Liara's color shifts changed, patterns moving across her skin that Marcus had learned indicated something like regret or concern. You are under my protection now, she said firmly. As my chosen ceremonial companion, you are extended the same political protections as any member of the royal household. Lord Varen cannot act against you directly without challenging my family's authority, which even he would hesitate to do. But there are indirect methods, subtle pressures and political maneuvers that could create difficulties. Wonderful, Marcus said, and was surprised to hear himself laugh slightly. The sound was edged with hysteria but humor nonetheless. I came here to analyze technical specifications and file infrastructure reports. Instead, I'm sitting in the royal section holding hands with a princess while angry nobles plan subtle revenge. This is definitely not what my recruitment officer described. Princess Liara's expression shifted again, and Marcus was reasonably certain she was amused despite her controlled demeanor. The universe rarely conforms to recruitment descriptions. But you have shown resourcefulness already, saving my brother without thought for political advantage. That quality will serve you well in the coming days. The coming days, Marcus repeated. How long does this ceremonial companion arrangement last? That depends on several factors, Princess Liara said. Traditionally, such acknowledgements last through the remainder of the ceremony and the associated formal events. However, given the political circumstances and the need to maintain the protection I have extended, it would be advisable for you to remain in that role somewhat longer. Perhaps through the end of the treaty negotiations and associated diplomatic functions. Which could be weeks, Marcus said, feeling his brief moment of humor evaporating. Possibly months, Princess Liara corrected. The treaty renewal includes numerous protocols and celebrations across multiple worlds. Your presence as my companion would be expected at most significant functions. Marcus looked at her, this alien princess who had grabbed his wrist and disrupted her own political arrangements to honor a debt he hadn't known existed. She was asking him to trust her, to accept a role he didn't understand in a political conflict he hadn't chosen. Every logical part of his training suggested he should contact Ambassador Chen immediately, report the situation, and request extraction from what was clearly becoming an extremely complicated mess. But he thought about the young Viridian he'd helped 3 months ago, someone who'd been sick and frightened and possibly dying. He'd provided assistance because it was the right thing to do, because medical emergencies didn't care about politics or species differences. And now that simple act of helping had created consequences that extended far beyond anything he'd imagined. Humanity's greatest strength, Marcus said slowly, is adapting to chaos we don't fully understand. Or at least that's what my xenocultural professor used to say. Usually right before describing some historical disaster that humanity somehow survived through sheer stubborn adaptability. Princess Liara tilted her head slightly, a gesture that might have indicated curiosity. You will accept the role then? I don't think I have much choice, Marcus said. But I'll need information, proper briefings about Viridian political structures and House Crimson's capabilities. If I'm going to be your ceremonial companion while angry nobles plot subtle revenge, I'd prefer to understand what I'm facing. That can be arranged, Princess Liara said, and Marcus was certain he heard approval in her voice. My personal staff will provide comprehensive briefings on all relevant political factors. And I will ensure you have appropriate security and communication access should any situation become threatening. The return. The ceremonial drums began their rhythm again, signaling the end of the intermission. Throughout the hall, delegates began returning to their seats in preparation for the treaty signing portion of the ceremony. Princess Liara straightened her robes and adopted her formal composure once more, the moment of relative openness disappearing behind the mask of royal dignity. We should return, she said. The treaty signing will begin shortly, and my absence would be noted. They walked back to the royal section together, and Marcus was aware of the stares that followed their movement. Ambassador Chen caught his eye from the Earth delegation section, her expression carefully neutral but her body language suggesting they would be having a very long conversation when the ceremony concluded. Other delegates whispered as they passed, and Marcus's translator implant caught fragments in multiple languages, all speculating about the human who had somehow captured the princess's attention. When they reached the royal section, Princess Liara settled into her seat with practiced grace. Marcus took his position beside her, and after a moment's hesitation, she reached over and took his hand again. The gesture was deliberate and public, a clear statement that whatever protection she had extended during the intermission remained in effect. The Emperor and Empress returned to their thrones, and the Viridian official who would oversee the treaty signing approached the central platform. Throughout the hall, representatives from 7 worlds prepared to formally renew the agreement that had maintained peace and cooperation for 5 decades. Marcus sat beside Princess Liara, her cool hand holding his, and watched alien diplomats conduct ceremonies that represented decades of careful negotiation. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment, from a transport malfunction to a desperate search for an appropriate seat to an alien princess grabbing his wrist and changing his entire diplomatic assignment in seconds. The acceptance. Ambassador Chen would probably be furious or possibly impressed, or most likely some combination of both emotions that would manifest as 3 hours of debriefing questions. Lord Chancellor Varen and House Crimson would continue plotting whatever subtle revenge they could arrange without directly challenging royal authority. And Marcus would spend the foreseeable future serving as ceremonial companion to an alien princess while trying to navigate political complexities he barely understood. But he'd saved someone's life 3 months ago without knowing who they were or calculating political advantage. That single act of basic human decency had created ripples he couldn't have predicted, consequences that now placed him at the center of conflicts between royal houses on a planet millions of kilometers from Earth. And somehow, despite the confusion and danger and complete disruption of his carefully planned career trajectory, Marcus found himself accepting the situation with something approaching calm. Humanity had survived and thrived by adapting to circumstances they didn't fully understand. Humans had walked into alien environments with incomplete information and somehow managed to build relationships across species barriers that evolution never intended to exist. They had faced chaos and uncertainty and political complexity, and they had endured through stubborn determination and the simple willingness to help others when help was needed. Marcus squeezed Princess Liara's hand gently, a gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance. She glanced at him briefly, and he thought he saw approval in her violet eyes. Then she turned her attention back to the ceremony, her expression serene, her posture perfect. The treaty signing began with formal declarations in 7 languages, each civilization's representatives approaching the platform to speak words that committed their worlds to continued cooperation. Marcus sat in the royal section, holding hands with an alien princess, and accepted that sometimes humanity's greatest achievements came not from careful planning but from simple acts of decency that created consequences nobody could predict. The ceremony would continue for hours, followed by formal receptions and diplomatic functions that would extend through the evening. And Marcus would attend them all, serving as the princess's chosen companion, navigating political conflicts with incomplete information and limited understanding, relying on the same adaptability that had allowed humanity to survive every other impossible situation they'd encountered. He was a human diplomat sitting in the royal section of an alien palace, holding hands with a princess while angry nobles plotted revenge and 500 witnesses watched and speculated. It was chaos, complicated and potentially dangerous, and definitely not what his recruitment officer had described. But humans had built their entire civilization by adapting to chaos they didn't fully understand. And Marcus was discovering that sometimes the best strategy was simply to accept the situation, trust the allies you'd inadvertently made, and face whatever came next with the stubborn determination that defined his entire species. The treaty signing continued, representatives speaking their formal commitments while Marcus sat beside Princess Liara and wondered what other unexpected consequences his simple act of helping someone in distress might create. Whatever came next, he will face it with the same resourcefulness that had served humanity throughout its history of encountering the impossible and somehow surviving. And in the grand ceremonial hall of the Crystal Spire Palace, surrounded by aliens from 7 worlds, Marcus Rivera accepted his new role and the chaos it represented, trusting that somehow, like humans always did, he would find a way to adapt and endure. The end.